How to read Paul's letter to the Romans. I don't know whether you were like myself, but when I was converted I recognized that Romans was a very special part of the New Testament. And I can remember reading it in my bedroom and just not knowing how to make sense of it. And I read and read and reread, but it just didn't go into my brain cells. It was just a letter that seemed to be speaking about things that I didn't understand to people I had no knowledge of. And I always had a respect for the letter because everybody told me how important it was. It had changed societies, it had transformed lives, but it was not making the impact on me that I felt it should make. I came to the conclusion that the reason I couldn't make any progress was because I lacked the spiritual experience that Paul had and which he spoke about in the letter. So it was really a retreat from the possibility, at least for the time being, of understanding what was going on. Have you ever had that thought that I can't understand it because I haven't had the experience?
Yeah.
But when you start thinking like that, you're simply saying that an awful lot of Christians in Rome, Paul had never met them, he didn't know what their spiritual life was about, he is somehow assuming that they can understand what he's saying, and he's never met them to know whether they are first, second, third or fourth class Christians, if there are such Christians in Paul's mind, and there never were. So there must have been something else. I eventually went to theological college and I studied Romans and the Greek text. And I still didn't know what the letter was about. I knew what commentators said about different passages, but I couldn't honestly say that I knew what the letter to the Romans was about. As a young pastor, I remembered hearing that Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones said he resisted preaching through Romans until he understood what Romans was about. And I thought, well, that's good. I'll follow that guidance. But after 6 years being a pastor, I thought, at this rate, I'm going to be in heaven before I understand what it's about, and it'll be too late to tell people what it's about. They'll know all about it. So that persuaded me to attempt to preach through Romans. And it was when I was getting to chapter 5, and particularly chapter 6, that I was finding that commentators were saying things that just weren't making sense. And the thing which I didn't like most of all was that they were actually taking the words that Paul used when he wrote in Greek and said, Paul does not mean this because, and they give an explanation, he means this. And so they were actually changing the argument. And because I had a view of Scripture which wouldn't allow me to play with the text like that, unless it could be shown that there were ancient Greek texts which were corrupted and this was perhaps what Paul actually wrote, not what we had in our version, I was very uncomfortable. And I remember preaching and coming to the conclusion that my problem was that I'd been trained to read the New Testament as though it was a Greek document. And all my thinking had been, from the time I went to junior school, had all been in Greek terms. We don't realize that, we just go to school, but it's actually a Greek philosophy that drives our education system. I'd been taught like that, as virtually all other Christians had, and we struggled with what really was a Jewish document. Written to a church which had a lot of Gentiles in, but which had Jewish teachers. So when these Gentiles were having difficulty with words, because in their thinking it meant one thing, but in Jewish thinking it meant another, the Jewish teachers could explain what it meant for the Jewish community. To give you an example of this, the word flesh for the Jews means one thing, And there's nothing sinful in itself about the meaning of the word flesh. So much so that in the Old Testament, the great blessing of the New Covenant was God saying, I will give them hearts of flesh. So it's not going to be a sinful thing if God's going to give us hearts of flesh. But in Greek thinking, the flesh is sinful. And we hear that term regularly. The sinful flesh. But that's a very Greek term, not a Jewish term. And it was trying to work out how these terms differed between the two communities that led me increasingly to realize that nearly the whole New Testament, if not the entire New Testament, was Jewish writing to Christians, most of whom had been brought up in the synagogue and then converted. Even the Gentiles had been synagogue attenders, worshippers amongst the God-fearers. They had a different mindset from mine. Once I began to read Romans, seeing the way that they thought, and especially against the Old Testament, it began to make a huge amount of sense for me. I finished up doing a PhD in which I presented these ideas, and I honestly did expect, and so did Dr. Davis, that I would probably have to do an awful lot of work before my examiners would agree with me, but they agreed. And then I wrote a book called Contours of Pauline Theology, and expected a lot of people to disagree with me, and to my surprise, some of the leading academics around the world agreed, and I thought, well, what's going on here? And they were saying, yes, the Jewish mindset makes far better explanation than our normal way of reading it as a Greek document. Well, Kerry mentioned that I wrote a commentary on Romans called The Divine Marriage. And it was called that because I believe that the illustration in chapter 7 verse 1 where Paul says, I speak to you who know the law, that a woman is married to her husband as long as her husband is alive. But if the husband dies, she's free and may marry another. Most people see that as an illustration. And I came to realize it was not an illustration at all. It was a theological theme going back into the Old Testament of God marrying Israel. And the only way he could bring that marriage to an end was through her death, putting her into exile, intending to take a new covenant people to himself. And that's at the heart of what's going on in Romans. So there's just some of the ideas. They're a lot simpler than I just told you about in this, because it works verse by verse and explains in detail. And I did wonder as to whether people would be able to follow it in this format. And it's been tremendously encouraging for me that there have been reviews. It's not been out an awful long time, but there have been reviews posted on Amazon.com, and an American newspaper published a review, and others, people who I don't know. And their comments have been about how easy it is for them to read it and to follow it. So that's been a great encouragement. Don't be intimidated. It's, from what they say, an easy read. And would you agree with that, Kerry? Okay, so there's it from somebody you can trust. So let me just talk to you about how to read Paul's letter to the Romans. I've already indicated that it's a Jewish document, and that is very important. And we're going to read it in the way that we normally read a letter, with all the things that go on in our mind, which naturally do as part of our own culture. It doesn't really tick the boxes. So the first thing to do is to recognize that the letter is not a thesis, it's a letter. When I was at theological college many moons ago, we approached it as a thesis. It was Paul setting out his great doctrines. Now, that is not to say that there is not great doctrines there. As a letter, its main object was to teach doctrine, and was not to teach doctrine, although there's a lot of doctrine in the letter. So that was not its main purpose. It had another purpose. It was a letter. And the letter if we think about it, let us have a storyline. When you write to somebody, you're writing in the context, you're writing about things that you know about, you're talking about people that you know about. There's comments about history. It might be saying what a lovely holiday you had together, and there's a storyline within a letter. That doesn't exist in a thesis. What's the storyline behind this letter to the Romans? The letter is to prepare the church for her contribution to Paul's planned mission to Spain. That's the reason, I think, Paul wrote the letter. At the end, in the final chapters, he talks about his hope to come to them on his way to Spain, that he might enrich them and they him. And when Paul was doing his missionary work, he had an incredibly important strategy. He didn't go as a great evangelist. He went as the enabler of other people. That's very important. He went as the enabler. I think we tend to think of Paul being there, rather like that picture of Whitfield, standing on a hill and preaching to the thousands. I don't think that was really typical of Paul's strategy. He would get a team with him, and going to Rome, he was going to the nearest place where the gospel existed, and he wanted to take people from Rome, Christians with him, into Spain to work together, because they were the nearest to that area of the world, and they would have known more about the people and the culture, because people from Spain would have come into Rome and done trade, and so these were the ideal people to accompany him. But the best evidence of the power of the gospel would be if he could take Jews and Gentiles who were known all over the world to be at each other's throats, and if he could take them as part of his team, that would be living evidence of the power of the gospel. So Paul wants to take a team with him, and this is part of the reason for his preparation. The letter seeks to resolve the pastoral issues that could have hindered the mission. Now, we don't have any evidence that there were big problems in Rome between the Jews and the Gentiles. There's no evidence within the letter about that. But in almost all the other letters, and certainly Galatians, it's a huge problem. And if it didn't happen to be there in Rome, Paul would expect it really would come there. I remember many years ago, in fact it was 25 years ago, somebody reminded me, because I met this person in Romania, and this guy is from America, and I emailed him a couple of weeks ago, and he mentioned that was 25 years ago. When I went there, I was talking to them about new ideas which were coming in. And they said, no, we don't want to know these ideas. Don't tell us about it. We don't have these problems. You just leave us. Just tell us about what the Bible says. And I made the prediction. I said, you will know about these ideas within 10 years. And if you're not ready for them, it will devastate your churches. It happened. The new ideas were about the new perspective. If you don't understand that, then you can talk to Kerry or Dr. Davis or any of the other folk who know about it, and they'll tell you. But the new perspective ideas eventually reached Romania and have done a lot of damage. And all I'm saying is that Paul would have known that eventually these problems would have reached the Roman community, and there would be loggerheads between the Gentiles and the Jews. And in fact, I suspect it was already beginning to happen, because the Jews had been expelled from Rome, and the Gentile Christians had risen as the strongest group, and then the Jews were allowed back to Rome. And they came back not as those in charge, but those who are now a minority grouping. Can you imagine the stress between those two groups as they tried to relate to each other? So Paul is aware of the problems that will exist if they don't already exist. The big pastoral issue was the Jewish-Gentile relations within the church. And we find that coming right to the fore in chapters 9 to 11. But they're going on earlier on in the early parts of the chapter. Paul's talking about Jews and Gentiles and how the law functions and so on. But it's this which he is concerned about. Now, the theology found in the letter is to encourage the mutual respect and unity. So that's what the storyline of the letter is about. Paul is going to go on a missionary journey. He wants to take a team with him of Jews and Gentiles. He knows that the problems everywhere, or almost everywhere else he's been dealing with, if he doesn't know that they're already there in Rome, he expects that they will be. There's some evidence that he's aware of the difficulties emerging, but he's anxious that when he comes to them, that they'll have a unity together and that they will support him in this mission to Spain. So we have to recognize that letters have storylines, and we have to recognize the sort of elements in the storyline, and then we can pick up as we're reading the letter what Paul is talking about and why he moves on from chapter to chapter, raising different issues. These are the issues which he has got to answer if he's going to encourage them in the way he wants to. Now, when you come to read the letter, there's something which also you must recognize, and that is the importance of typology in all of Paul's letters. Now, I don't know if you know what the word typology means, but a type is a picture of something far greater. In the Old Testament we have stories, for example, Abraham offering up Isaac, and that is a type, we say, of the father giving up his son at Calvary. So that Old Testament story anticipates a far greater fulfillment. And right through the New Testament we get types, especially in the letter to the Hebrews. There's a lot of types. That what happened in the tabernacle or the temple was a picture of what was going to happen when Jesus died on the cross. We've got the idea there of the high priest, and he is a type of Jesus, who is our great high priest. See what he was doing, what he was accomplishing for the Jewish people, and Jesus achieves far, far, far more for his own people. So in the Old Testament there are these pictures, historical events, and the early church could see that they were predicting something far greater, and they made a lot of use of that. Now, in Romans, there is a tremendous amount of what we call typology, looking at for those relationships in the Old Testament. In fact, I would suggest that the whole letter is built into this type of thinking. There in the Old Testament, you have an anticipation of what's going to come in the New Testament. I wonder how many of you enjoy doing jigsaw puzzles? Anyone? How would you like it if I gave you a jigsaw puzzle made up of 3 jigsaws, all mixed together, and no lid, not one lid, not one, and you had to put it all together? And you had to demonstrate that it was an absolute convincing picture that you'd created, that all 3 makers of the jigsaw puzzle had intended you to understand and construct. Would that be a challenge of a lifetime for you? I can assure you that if you were to achieve that, you'd be quite remarkable. You'd have a mind like a computer that's yet to be designed. It's just impossible. But the way in which we've approached interpreting the New Testament is that Paul has 3 different worlds. He has his Old Testament world, he has the Jewish world of his day, and he has the Greek world, and he takes all the pieces from these worlds and he puts them there, and you're supposed to understand the picture that he's creating. Impossible. It really is. To put together a convincing, persuasive, powerful picture of Paul's message. It's impossible. And I believe, sadly, that that's why the church hasn't made the impact that it really should make. Because when people begin to realize that the New Testament is actually about the Old Testament, and you don't have to go to the Roman Greek world, and you don't have to go to the contemporary Jewish world, you just stay in that one world of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And as you're putting the pieces together in the New Testament, you say, how does this fit? Where does this go? And you look at the Old Testament type, the history of Israel and what God did for her. That is the lid of the box of the jigsaw puzzle. And you're able to match the pieces and say, ah, yes, that fits there. Now what do I do with this piece that speaks about redemption? Ah, yes, it fits there. And this about adoption, where does that fit? Ah, yes, it fits there with redemption. And all the pieces begin to fit together. And without an awful lot of effort. Got to make some effort. But certainly nothing like the effort that you had to sort of make, and the things that you had to master just to have some resemblance of what Paul was supposed to be teaching. All that's swept away, and all you're doing is you're reading your New Testament in the light of the Old Testament. What a surprise that that's St. Paul, who said that he was a Jew, the Hebrew of the Hebrews, is doing that. He keeps to his own Old Testament traditions. So we recognize the importance of typology in Paul's letters, and I can't spend too much time, but you'll find that Hope for the Nations is explaining that in detail. Also, we've got to recognize the importance of the Old Testament. The Old Testament quotations are vital keys to understanding the letter. Now, right the way through Romans, there is page after page when there's not just one or two quotes, there can be half a dozen quotes in the one chapter. One of the things which amazed me when I was doing my research all those years ago was when I began to realize that the Old Testament was so important for Paul, I began to look to see what were the parts of the Old Testament that he spent most time quoting. What were the most important parts to him? There were three books. There was the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Psalms, and the book of Isaiah. They stick out like three Mount Everests above all the others. All the others are contributing, but they are the major themes, where the major themes come from. When I looked at the book of Isaiah, and I looked through all his quotations in the book of Romans, he actually quotes Isaiah 18 times in the letter to the Romans. If you were to take the letter to the Romans and you were to open it out, it would have been written on a scroll, and you rolled it out so it was on a long table, and you took each of the quotations from the book of Isaiah and you raised them up out of the letter. You know how you see it on television, it's very clever, and they've got all those graphics and they would just rise up above the text and you see them. Well, you've got to imagine that. And you begin to read those quotations from the book of Isaiah, all those quotations, one after another, after another, after another. Something incredible happens. You suddenly realize that those quotations are a summary of the history of salvation from the fall of man to the coming of the Messiah to judge the world. 18 texts taken from the book of Isaiah, and every one contributes to the story. The story unfolds. I just supervised an American who looked at chapters 9 to 11 of Romans, and he was tracing how when Paul cites a text, you understand that text, and then he cites another text, and you have to take the understanding you've gained from that text, you have to take it back to this new text and gain a fuller understanding, and then those combined understandings you take to the next text, and you get a bigger understanding, you go back to the Old Testament, and there is that pattern. It's not happened by accident. It's a man who's soaked in Scripture, tracing what God has done for his people and through his Son Jesus. incredibly detailed working. Now, you're not expected to spend 3 or 4 years doing a PhD. That fellow's done it and eventually be published. But what I'm saying is that there's such incredible strength showing the link between New Testament and Old Testament that you can be confident that you're getting very close, if not actually hitting the pin on the head when you're reading the text. You're saying, this is what Paul is speaking about. He's speaking about these grand themes. He's not talking about my experience. He's talking about the experience all God's people share in, and that I share in because I'm one of his people. So we're beginning to see there's a hugely bigger picture. Now, I've got to admit here, and I come with great shame, should have been a final slide. And I'm terribly embarrassed. Because you see, the book is actually called A Corporate Reading. And I forgot to mention it when I was preparing the slides last night. Which shows you I was so tired. we just travelled back from Kent, and I wasn't really have a 5-6 mile drive. I wasn't thinking too well, so you'll forgive me, I hope. But this really is very important. When we're reading that letter, it is not about us personally. Just like the Old Testament is all about God's dealing with Israel, so Romans and all Paul's letters, apart from the ones that he writes to individuals like Philemon and Timothy, but even they've got strong resonances with this. But when he's writing to the church, he's telling them what God has done for them as his people. It's corporate. It's typically Jewish. We think typically Greek because that's what Greeks do. It's about me. And Jews said, no, it's not about you. It's about God's people. I remember when I first began to understand this, we had a lecturer at West who had lived in Africa. And I said to Tom, I think this is what's going on. He said, well, that's interesting. He said, in Africa, if you ask an African his name, he'll tell you his tribe. And you say, no, I don't want to know your tribe's name. I want your name. So he'll tell you his father's name. Say, no, I want your name. And then he'll say, oh, Kobo. But he just can't think of himself first. It doesn't work. That's the curse of Western evangelicalism. We begin with ourselves. And because we begin with ourselves, we get everything revolving around ourselves, and we think that we're the most important person on earth as far as God's concerned. Well, actually, we're very, very important to him. But his son is the most important person. And his people that he's redeemed through his son's death. And we're privileged to be part of that redeemed community. So we need to get that in perspective. So this is a corporate reading. Whereas you might look at some commentaries and they're explaining it, and when Paul says that you died to sin, and they explain to you what it means that you have died to sin and how you're to claim that, well, actually I don't think he's talking about your experience. He's talking about the Christian community having died to Satan's control. This community is no longer under the control of Satan. Just like the Jewish people were no longer under Pharaoh's control. They were being redeemed and brought to be a new people. So through the death of Jesus, God has brought from the kingdom of darkness a new community. And it's died to all the powers of Satan. And this new community is now under the lordship of Jesus. It doesn't say that we're perfect. But it does say that Satan's power over us is now finished. And we live as a liberated, forgiven, new creation.